Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We will be starting shortly in about 1 minute. In the meantime, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat box, put your name, your organization or affiliation, and what state you're in.
Hello, my name is Lamartine Alvarez. I am happy to be here this morning, and I look forward to learn a little bit more.
Excited to have you, Lamar.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the We're All America National Refugee Advocacy Days. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you can share in the chat box your name, your organization, affiliation, and what state you're in. I'm Nada. I am with We Are All America, and I reside in Arizona. So it's good to see you all on this Friday. So we're going to jump right into the agenda. Some of the things that we're going to cover today, I know some folks joined our training that we held last week. This is kind of our backup training for folks who did not have an opportunity to attend last week's training or watch the recording. This is kind of an opportunity for you to ask questions before our advocacy days next week. So today we're going to give you some background about advocacy days. We're going to do a little bit of Refugee 101 and provide you updated statistics globally and in the US where we're at with the refugee resettlement program. We're going to go over some of the meeting logistics, the policy asks and talking points, and then we're going to go over a little bit about communications and media and expectations around that. All right, and then we'll of course have a Q&A session. A couple of things just to keep in mind, if you could please keep your audio on mute when you're not speaking, that way it doesn't interrupt our facilitators. This session will be recorded and shared out, and as I mentioned, we will have a Q&A session at the end for you to ask questions. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. For those of you who don't know, We're All America is a national campaign. We really work to uphold and strengthen our nation's commitment to welcoming those who are seeking freedom, safety, and refuge. We started our work back in 2017 when we saw the rise of anti-refugee, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and that's when national resettlement agencies and immigrant rights organizations came together to be able to respond and form the We're All America campaign. These are on our picture here, you can see these are our steering committee partners that we have been doing work with and have been expanding our work over the years. We can go to the next slide. And so why are we doing this? Well, this is the first advocacy days that we're hosting nationally. A lot of our organizers have hosted their advocacy days at the state and local level. However, we felt an urgent need to really organize something that is refugee and immigrant led at the national level, along with our national partners. During the August recess, when members of Congress are in their districts, visiting their home states, to really build up the momentum for some of you who may have participated during RCUSA advocacy days back in May. So on here, you'll see some of our participating organizations, and really there's two main goals for these advocacy days. Number one is to advocate for pro-refugee and asylum legislation that we'll discuss, and really to hold the current administration accountable around that refugee admissions cap, and not just placing that cap, but actually reaching that cap of how many refugees we welcome in our country. And the second is to engage refugee and immigrant leaders in direct advocacy with members of Congress. Let's go to the next slide. So that's really our two main goals. As I mentioned, we are set for advocacy days throughout next week during work hours. However, there may be some meetings that we do anticipate a couple of meetings to be outside of these dates, maybe further out. But in that case, we will definitely communicate that with you if for whatever reason they can't be between these dates next week. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to shift a little bit and talk about Refugee 101. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of updated data and statistics from the UNHCR on the number of displaced people, and to kind of give you a picture, more reason of why we're doing this. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Pierre, who is our Florida organizer with FLIC. Really glad to have you. And Pierre, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Naira. Next slide, please. Yes, my name is Pierre, and I am with FLIC as a refugee organizer, and I am an immigrant as well. I am originally from Rwanda, and so I'm going to talk very briefly about the global trends. Right now, in the first 6 months of this year, we had close to 100 million individuals that were displaced worldwide. And this is because of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. So as compared to last year, there is an increase of 10.7 million people displaced, and that's really a big number. So among the 100 million, we have 26.6 million that are refugees in the whole world, the highest ever seen. We have 50.9 million that are displaced internally into their own countries. They left their homes and they are scattered all over their countries and they are not in their homes. We have 4.4 million asylum seekers among the 100 million people. And we have 4.1 million Venezuelans displaced abroad that are also included in the 100 million people. Guess what? 100 million people, that's more than the entire population of Germany. Imagine the whole country of Germany displaced. How chaotic that would be. And that's the chaos we live in now. Next slide, please. Where are those people coming from? 69% come from only five countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, that's Burma. And where are they fleeing to? They are being hosted in 38% of them are hosted in 5 countries, which are Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany. 5 countries hosting 38%. Let's go to the next slide, please. You may be wondering, what is the average time a refugee spends in a camp? When they leave their countries, they live in refugee camps. And can anyone guess what is the average time they spend in a refugee camp? You can write the number in the chat, and somebody says 17 years, 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, 10, 15, between 11 and 15, 31 years. Oh yes. So yeah, the answer is right here. The average is 10 years. But I know people who have been there, like somebody who mentioned 31 years. I know people, I am a refugee myself. I have people in Rwanda who came from Congo. They live in a refugee camp since 1994. That's 28 years, and they're still living there. Children who were born there, they grew up, and now they are married, and they have children too. Let's go to the next slide, please. So when they are in a refugee camp, what are the solutions, to their lives? One is a voluntary repatriation to their home countries. They can go back to their home countries, if they wish so. Secondly is integration into the country of first asylum. So the countries that we saw, the 5 of them that are hosting 38%, if, for instance, you are in Uganda and you decide that you are comfortable in Uganda and you want to stay there, so the second option is possible. You can be integrated into that country and stay there as an asylee or as a refugee. And the third option is the settlement to a third country. You can go to a third country, and according to statistics, only 1% gets to resettle to a third country. So that's really a small number. Next slide, please. So how is it in the US? In the first quarter, between first quarter and third quarter, we had 15,100 refugees that were admitted. And if you recall, the government had pledged to bring in 125,000 people. That was the goal. So you can see that's only 16% of the pledge. And basically, that's why we are holding, these advocacy days. We have to hold the administration accountable to what they say. They have to achieve it. So which are the states that are most welcoming refugees? We have California, which has the biggest, Texas, New York, Michigan, and Washington. And you may be wondering where those people are coming from. The top countries of the top 5 countries of refugees, where they come from, are Democratic Republic of Congo as the biggest, and then next Syria, Sudan, Burma, and Ukraine. And of course, we have these other people who are coming from Afghanistan and other countries as well. But you can see that Africa accounts for most of them, and then East Asia, Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, and then East and South Asia. So next slide, please. So many people wonder, and have come across so many people here in the US. They don't even know who a refugee is. They think a refugee is somebody who is here illegally. Most of them. Some of them are, that's the perception that they have. But who is a refugee? And what is the screening process that US uses, to bring refugees here? So a refugee is someone who has fled, his country, his home country, and cannot return because of, well-founded reasons, such as persecution based on religion, race, nationality, political opinion, or membership to a particular social group. And they go through a very robust system, a vetting process to bring them here, to make sure that they bring in people who really deserve to be brought here and they are clean. So there is first of all, to determine the refugee status, UN has to, use a number of criteria to determine whether someone, qualifies to be a refugee. And then there is a security clearance process that US and Homeland, within Homeland Security that, they use to run their background checks and, find out their history and see if they don't have any criminal offenses that they have committed in the past. And they run their medical, history to do medical screening. And there is a lot of things that they do. And the whole of that process takes between 18 months and 3 years. And so once everything is cleared, and then the process of resettlement starts. So it's a very, very robust, screening process. And once they are cleared, like I said, they are brought here. Next slide, please. Yes, so that's the US, how it stands, and that's why we are, going to do the advocacy days next week to talk about the whole resettlement process, and then I will pass it over to Neira to talk about logistics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pierre. So I know for some of you, this information may be familiar, that you're, very well versed in some of these statistics, but maybe for some of you, this is more newer information. So we just wanted to share some of these more updated numbers from the UNHCR, where we now are seeing over 100 million people who are globally displaced, and also where we're at now that we're coming to a close in the federal fiscal year at the end of next month. So now that you kind of have a better idea of where we're at globally and here in the States, we're going to kind of shift a little bit to talk more specifically about advocacy days and the logistics around that, particularly around your role. So let's go to the next slide. So really a couple of things around your role and what we need help and support with. And we certainly greatly appreciate, you taking the time to sign up and register and participate for this important cause. So we really ask that you are in touch with your group lead, your accompanier, and participate in the group prep call. That may have happened for you this week, or it will happen in the coming days as final schedules are being finalized. We ask that you review the participant handbook. This has a lot of prep materials, including the policy asks, the leave behind material. This will really help you with some of these statistics that we mentioned and help you feel better prepared. And then finally, participate in the congressional meetings with your delegation. So those are the 3 asks, and let's go to the next slide. Some meetings will happen in person in congressional offices. Some may happen virtually, depending on the office and availability. The group leads, accompaniers are setting up the meetings on your behalf. At times it is difficult to get a hold of some offices, more difficult than others. So if you haven't heard from your group lead, it may be because they haven't been able to secure a meeting yet. I would still, if you still have not heard from them, just let me know, email me, or shoot me a text, and I'll put my contact information in the chat box, and I'll be happy to connect you with your group lead. But if you haven't heard from them for any reason, it's probably mostly because of that. And participants, so you all will only expect to attend maybe 2 to 3 legislative meetings. Although we do have some delegations and congressional target lists that are rather bigger than others, like for example, in the state of California or New York. Be prepared for meetings to last 15 to 30 minutes. So when you think about your talking points, think about just that time frame that you have to be in those meetings. And be aware you may or may not meet directly with member of Congress. You may meet with their staff if the member of Congress is not available. Let's go on to the next slide. If you're having a virtual meeting, just make sure that you do check your software beforehand, that you check your audio and video feed for quality, that, you know, you don't need any last minute updates, you know, while you're trying to log on to the meeting, the Zoom meeting. Make sure that you're on mute when you're not talking. That way there's not background noise. And be sure to log on 10-15 minutes earlier with your group, just to prepare last minute, and that you all are there on time. Be sure to speak clearly, and use your video, and that you have enough light source so they can see your face clearly. So just some things to keep in mind if you're doing virtual meetings, and I think most of you are familiar with that. So let's go on to the next slide. So the delegation coordination. So during your prep call, really the purpose of that is to help everyone prepare and know what their roles are and their talking points. So during your group prep call, you're going to go over that. You're going to go over your talking points, what everyone will be, what everyone wants to say, what they're comfortable saying, the policy ask, who's going to talk about the resettlement statistics and asylum statistics. You're also going to discuss with your accompanier your meeting schedule, what's been confirmed, what's not, the location. So they will go over that with you during that call. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over some of the meeting logistics, you kind of have a better idea of what to expect around that. We're going to go over a little bit deeper into the policy ask, so we're going to cover that. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Susanna Cunningham, who's the Advocacy Manager for Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services. Susanna, are you on?
Hi there, yeah.
Wonderful. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, and I'll just give you a heads up that please excuse me if you hear me every once in a while say next slide. And I don't think I have the ability to mess with it. So I'll just say it's really lovely to be here with you. I lead congressional affairs for Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, and get to be part of a number of great coalitions and campaigns like this. So it is great to be here. So a little bit about, you know, you understand kind of the logistics of the meeting, and you understand that you'll start with the idea of your story, or why this matters to you, why you're participating in this, and why you think the legislator really needs to come and support the very things that you're asking for. Well, these are the things, the policy asks that you'll be mentioning, bringing up, and asking for. And I want you to keep in mind as we go over this that there'll be leave behinds for this. So you're going to talk top line about a lot of these policy asks, and then resources will be given to the staffers, or, you know, if you meet with the legislator themselves, to sort of look into the material more. Okay, so the policy asks will center around these sort of leading priorities. And the one, you know, the first one is rebuild and strengthen the U.S. refugee admissions program. You know, the way that you can think about that is the decimation of the refugee program we saw since over 2017 to 2021, where so few refugees were welcomed to the U.S. We want to rebuild and re-strengthen it, and that can mean a lot of things, both in the executive and in Congress. We want to restore access and strengthen the U.S. asylum and humanitarian U.S. asylum system and humanitarian protections. This very same basis of the refugee program, the Convention on Refugees, is the thing that undergirds the asylum system. They are the same resounding principles that were born out of very difficultly learned lessons in World War II, that we needed to have a system to welcome people who were fleeing persecution and for their lives. So we want to make sure that we're restoring access to it. And we'll talk a little bit about ways that why it needs to be restored, and ways that we can strengthen it. Okay, protect stateless people in the United States, and support the right to legal representation and federal funding related to legal representation and expansion of it. Next slide. Great. So this is a little, yeah, if you can go forward one. So to rebuild and strengthen the U.S. refugee program, we're asking Congress to urge the administration to set the fiscal year 23 refugee admissions goal of 200,000. The deadline for the president to set that goal is September 30th, and Congress has in the past really urged and tried to impart on the administration, you know, in this case, the Biden administration, to really have a robust number of goal post for refugee admissions. That's what the presidential determination is the term for determining how many that they would, you know, the U.S. government will welcome in FY 2023. And so we're going to urge Congress to set that, you know, just to ask them to really push the administration to have a robust goalpost for how many we welcome this year. And then there's these fundamental, these critical pieces of legislation that you may have already heard about. One is the Afghan Adjustment Act. The Afghan Adjustment Act got a bipartisan introduction in the House and the Senate from 6 senators in the Senate last week, an even split between Republican and Democrat, and 8 Congress members in the House with an even split of Republicans and Democrats. And we're really seeing this month as a critical time as you meet with your legislators and legislative offices to push for this legislation. It has the support of the leading veteran service organizations, from the American Legion to the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, to veterans of foreign wars, the VFW. All of these people are pushing and meeting with their members of Congress and their senators to ask for the passage of the Afghan Adjustment Act this September. That bill will provide lasting protections for Afghans. If you know, many of the evacuees who came last year after the fall of the Afghan elected government, they arrived here under what is described as humanitarian parole. It's a temporary protection. It lasts for a maximum of 2 years. So most of them, it will run out by August of 2023. August of next year, and after which they have no clear pathway to be able to legally stay, despite the fact that they were evacuated by the U.S. Government and put on U.S. military planes and brought here. They will have no clear status unless they're able to find another pathway. And for many of them, they're the best option to be able to handle this many people coming. There were over 80,000 people who came to the U.S. through that evacuation. The best means to get them that pathway to citizenship or that pathway to a green card that they would have received through, for instance, the refugee program, is to pass an adjustment act, which is something Congress has done for every other wartime evacuation that has ever been brought to the U.S., including the Vietnamese after the fall of Saigon. So this is a really important bill. It has a real chance of passing in September. So in the meetings, urging you to talk about the critical of their timely support for the bill, and that it's a bipartisan bill with bipartisan support in both chambers. The next is the Refugee Protection Act. The Refugee Protection Act really attempts, it's yet to be introduced, but it is really a bill that attempts to fortify the previous 1980 Refugee Protection Act. You know, Congress in 1980 passed a bill saying that we would welcome refugees here in the U.S. and that we would have a functioning asylum system. There have really been kind of extrajudicial just means outside of the law, efforts to try to obstruct the things that Congress in 1980 did, finding, you know, small ways to curb access to asylum at the border. This bill would attempt to really remind and fortify that this is that the refugee program, the asylum program, exist on a legal basis of bills that have already passed. It is U.S. codified law, just it has been this bill's reintroduction is a fortification of and a reminder to Congress of those, and then a few expansions that we can talk about in just a second. And then the last one, it gets a little wonky in this, which is federal funding to rebuild the refugee program. We said we want to restore the refugee program. That's going to be based on making sure that there's ample funding to really deal with the huge dismantlement that happened over the last administration, and make sure that people are able to hire back staffers to properly care for refugees, that those refugees are going to be eligible for services that really ensure that they get here and there's a means to thrive. Okay, next slide. So asylum, I mentioned that there were efforts to curb what had already been established law on the right to asylum. And there are a few of these. First, I want to acknowledge that there was some serious efforts to create a kind of indefinite asylum ban under what is deemed Title 42 extension. So Title 42 is the dubiously used use of immigration enforcement under a health code. So there's a health code that talks about this idea of for the intent of national interest or for health and national security, if you have to do some national emergency measures. And the last administration decided to use that to stop immigration. So for years, business and enterprise and tourism was allowed to pass over the southern border in 2021 and 2022. But the Biden administration's failure to repeal Title 42 for many months, for over a year of their administration, was really a continuance of a Trump era asylum ban, functionally, that functionally prevented people from presenting themselves at a port of entry and saying, I fear for my life. I have a credible fear that if I return back to my home. So there was a recent effort to try to include an extension of Title 42, an indefinite asylum ban in the Inflation Reduction Act, which Biden just signed last week. Those attempts failed on the Senate, and we're really grateful they did. But there are other policies like the Remain in Mexico program, which you'll sometimes hear described as the MPP, a migration protocol. Sorry. So these policies, that they recently made the decision that the Biden administration has the authority to do what they had set out to do, which is to revoke MPP, to revoke the Remain in Mexico program. And this was held up in the courts until recently, when the Supreme Court determined that, yes, in fact, the presidency does have the right to determine federal authority over immigration policy. So finally, we want to urge the administration to do a number of things to deal with this describes it. There are many ways that you could describe it, but to defend migrants of color. And the other is to make sure that the way that people, the other way to say this is that people aren't discriminated based on their race, their ethnicity, their language, their gender, etc., when they're seeking life-saving asylum. Also, we want to ask and to make sure that the administration really provides protections like the temporary, like TPS, like temporary protected status, for countries that are experiencing sort of credible and really extraordinary conditions that make it hard for people to survive, to live. And there are a number of countries that have yet to receive TPS. That means nationals of that country who are here are able to stay here, and sort of acknowledging the extraordinarily difficult nature of their country's conditions. There are a number of countries, for instance, Cameroon. So here it says African and Caribbean countries that have yet to receive TPS, while others have. And we want to make sure that we're not perpetuating sort of systemically racist policies. Exactly, Mauritania is another one. And that our immigration system provides safety for all those without discrimination and prejudice. And then the finally is means by which to restore an orderly, humane, and dignified access to asylum across the board. Next slide. Okay, so this is an unusual one. The Refugee Protection Act's reintroduction. I said that it was used to fortify already existing US law. American codified law, reminding legislators that it already exists. But there's also the issue that there really are few protections internationally, globally, for stateless individuals. The way to describe this is there are some, give you a practical basis. For many Americans, it's hard to imagine statelessness because in the US, if you were born in the US, your very birth confers citizenship. There are some individuals who were born in countries that do not have that principle, that just because you were, that an individual was born in that country does not confer citizenship to that country. And if they arrive here by any means, but if they arrive here in the US and they're seeking asylum, because they perhaps were born in this country that did not confer citizenship through birth, they wouldn't have clear citizenship. And that means a whole manner of things. You can imagine what your life would be like if there was no passport office to go to, there was no place to register a birth that would confer basic citizenship rights that we all enjoy. So the US really can be the leader on trying to really lead the way of providing a status for those who currently exist in legal limbo. So we hope that Congress can work with the administration to provide protections for stateless people, and it shows that 200,000 here, and create a legal pathway for them. Next slide.
So Susanna, are you saying that the Refugee Protection Act includes provisions for stateless people? Did I understand
Yes.
that correctly? Okay.
Yes, I'll share the yes, it does. It includes provisions, and I can try to read you some of the details, but the newest one, and just so you know, it's not the bill hasn't been introduced, so there's no externally facing, there's no text I can give you. But I can tell you that the bill leads that are working on it intend to try to create a legal recognition of stateless persons and to try to create a pathway to citizenship for them so that they can have a passport, so that they can register their births and their marriages, etc. Okay, and then finally, and good to see you, Miranda. Finally, legal representation. The principle around this when you meet is to support the right to legal representation and federal funding for that. And there are many bills in Congress that talk about this. So we're not isolating one. We simply want to say that the federal right to legal representation for those who are seeking asylum is something, and often cannot afford legal representation, is something that we want Congress to get behind. And in the world of criminal defense, we have access to a public defender. There's no such thing in immigration. And so we're really looking for this, in part because if you can imagine the stakes, how high the stakes are for many individuals who presented themselves, and sometimes even children, minors who have arrived here in the US and have to defend their right to stay and why they were persecuted. And so you have extraordinary circumstances where children, minor children, migrant children would be going to court cases to defend their right to asylum with no legal representation that was mandated. We see that as fundamentally cruel, and the abuse that exists in the immigration system of people taking, not in the system, but of taking advantage of migrants who are trying to make their case credibly of why they fear for returning to their country, really could be curbed by things like legal representation. Okay. Next slide. I think we're towards the end. Okay. Thanks so much. And I'll try to answer any questions in the chat.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Susanna. And if we're gonna give a little bit of time right now for questions, because I know that Susanna may need to hop off for other meetings, but before I open it up for questions, I just want to say that we all care about refugee and immigrant issues, and all of these policy asks are important. And if we could, we would include more. However, there is only so much bandwidth, that we can. And as you can see, this is a lot of information that we're sharing, that we're throwing out at you. And so being mindful of that when you go into these congressional meetings, the expectation is that you do not you do not have to say every single policy ask, but really work with your group, your accompanier, to see which of these policy asks best fits with the members of Congress you are meeting with. You know, right now, I will say that the top of the line that we're really focusing on at this moment is around the Afghan Adjustment Act, because really there is that momentum that we're really trying to capture and push for. But if you are an expert, for example, in asylum issues, and this is you know, where your advocacy strength is right now, and you're meeting with a member of Congress that is working around asylum issues, and that would be the conversation during your meetings, then that's fine. But we just wanted to share, like, these are the policy asks that we are focusing on, and it will be really up to your discretion engaging, you know, your member of Congress, and we are going to provide their bios for you. And yes, we will provide a copy of the slide deck and this recording and your handbook after this call. So I'm going to open it up for about 2-3 minutes just for questions. I see there is a question from Jennifer, if there is any current information on the situation in Haiti. Susanna, do you want to address that?
Yeah, Jennifer, I shared with you some details about the TPS designation for Haiti that happened in May of 2021. It's an 18-month designation. As you know, by the nature of temporary protected status, that's it is temporary. And so for the designation, sometimes they happen for 12 months, for 18 months. And each time there's either a renewal at the end of the 18 months, there's either nothing, no renewal, there's a renewal, which is just, that means the people who were eligible for TPS will continue to be eligible. And then there's redesignation, and redesignation means that people who came after the last deadline would also be eligible to stay, as well as the people who'd already received TPS. So that's an update on that status, and here's a link for more details in the chat.
Rose asked if there's if the bill has not been introduced, it's hard to point it. Do we just say stateless people? So I think this is a question around the stateless.
So this is the question around the Refugee Protection Act, which includes an intent to protect stateless persons. I guess you could say the Refugee Protection Act, you know, was the original Refugee Protection Act was passed in 1980. And that this latest bill is an update, a reinforcement of those principles, and an update to try to seek protections for stateless persons as well. That's what I would say if I was saying a very short version, which I hope you all will use short versions, because remember, you're going to be able to give them leave behinds. They're going to get all of the info on the technicalities.
Any other questions for Susanna? Feel free to unmute yourself.
The last thing I'll just say is that I want to reiterate with what's already been said, which is you have in front of your on these slides and before you are real opportunities. Sometimes we do this work where we have a lot of bills and we have questions whether or not what their pathway to passage is. And for the Afghan Adjustment Act, there really is a pathway in September, and you can have real and meaningful change for this bill that will provide sort of lasting protections for these individuals, and that helps the whole system. Every asylum seeker currently with an application at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is helped by the idea that these 80,000 people that were suddenly put in the pipeline aren't also part of the caseload that keeps staff from being able to move through and adjudicate other asylums. So we've all said, everyone across the immigration board says this would do right by Afghans, but it would also help the entire system. So I'm excited for the potential for this bill to move.
I think one last question, Susanna, can we find how many refugees are sent to states like Illinois?
I know, let me try to see and follow up with this resource. I'll ask. I do believe I don't know if there's a public resources, but I can try to see whether or not there's one of the reasons is I get sent data, but it's not discernible, like it's not user friendly. And try to see if there's a way that there's a user friendly mechanism that you could have and that would regularly update.
Thank you, Susanna, so much for your time. We appreciate it. If folks have any more questions, send it in the chat box. But we're gonna move ahead now into more specifics about the talking points and just helping you prepare. So I'm gonna pass it on to my colleague Kosar Kosar, who is the multicultural organizer with Turk in Tennessee. So I hand it over to you, Kosar.
Thank you, Neda. You can hear me, right? Want to confirm.
Yes.
Everything's all good. All right, perfect. Okay, so the purpose of this meeting is to, of course, share about the issues we care about and make our ask of our elected officials clear. And it's important that we are, very strategic in how we have this meeting and that we build a rapport. Everything in this section can be considered as a guidance, and your specific group lead will really help put together your agendas and assign roles and talking points. So don't feel the need to feel like this is set in stone. This is just a sample. This is just a template. You can adjust it as you see fit. Next slide. So right here, you can see our sample meeting agenda. As I said, this isn't set in stone. You could always edit it to how you see fit. Most organizations, or local organizations have probably maybe built a report with their members of Congress, and so maybe you already have history with that member of Congress, and so maybe you don't need to take too much time introducing yourself. But it's important that I think for this Advocacy Day, since this is the first National Refugee Advocacy Days, and we're working in conjunction with We Are All America, that you do introduce yourself and your group, as well as introducing kind of We're All America and kind of the purpose of this meeting. And it's important that when you're in these meetings, that all the delegates are given the opportunity to introduce themselves, emphasize the constituency they represent. So whether they're representing organizations, community group, congregations, but try to make this very, very succinct and very, very just because our meetings with these members of Congress are maybe from as low as 15 minutes to maybe 30 minutes max. And so it's important that you really don't take too much time to just introducing yourself, and that you don't get sidetracked. Second, it's important to kind of explain the purpose of the meeting. So for our meetings with the members of Congress for these advocacy days, it's important that we really emphasize and talk about the state of the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, and discuss those who are seeking safety and refuge. You have the why you care. You have to talk about why this issue is important to you. It's important that delegates do share their personal story, or why refugee resettlement and or humanitarian protections is important, and how refugees and immigrants enrich communities. And this is the very bulk of kind of the meat of the meeting. It's important that you kind of really display that sense of care, and then what you want. So it's important that we share our policy ask. And so it's when we're doing this, it's not it's good to not just have a laundry list of like X, we're doing this, we want this, this, and this. It's important that you kind of like take your time, and that maybe one person per policy ask, and it's important that you're strategic with who's sharing that policy ask. So if you're going to talk about refugee resettlement, maybe a recent refugee arrival, or someone from the resettlement program. So it's important that you kind of cater those questions to to folks, and it's important that we make them personal. And then as you close, it's just important to ask staff any questions they may have, and end the meeting, and just let provide those leave behind documents, and also let the the office know that you'll be following up afterwards with additional resources or anything else that We Are All America provides. Next slide. So talking points. Who you are. You are We Are All America related constituents from a state and district. You're here representing We Are All America, and for this specific National Advocacy Days. You're a supporter of refugees. You're either a refugee, a member of faith community, a resettlement provider, a volunteer, or employee. Your experience and values lead you to care about refugees, and you want your elected officials to care about refugees and to take action to support refugees. You have common ground with the member or staff person. So, if you're as delegates, the reason why you signed up, the reason why you're participating in this is because you do care about our refugee communities. And if you do have that story, it's important that you do share your unique story and share that perspective, because a lot of members of Congress don't look like us, and so it's important that we do share our stories. Next slide. Resettlement enjoys bipartisan support. Since its inception in 1980, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program has enjoyed bipartisan support from Republicans and Democratic presidents, and from Congress when led by either parties. Don't let anything mislead you. It's a very, very popular program, and has been widely supported over the decades. The robust nationwide support from vulnerable Afghans and Ukrainians demonstrate that welcome and humanitarian protections are American values. And it's important that we use this moment to channel those values into rebuilding the U.S. refugee program. As Nato mentioned, our U.S. refugee resettlement program has really taken a hit over these past few years and has been dismantled to a great extent. And so we're hoping to really rebuild that program and really live up to our values. Next slide. The other talking about why care about resettlement. Resettlement is a life-saving program for refugees, point blank period. It's important to U.S. humanitarian values. We espouse, we espouse welcoming values. We espouse, this notion of, the U.S. being welcoming to refugees and immigrants. And so it's important that, if we're talking the talk, that we walk the walk. It's important to U.S. foreign policy and national security, as well as to U.S. communities. Rebuilding the refugee resettlement program is necessary and important for a myriad of reasons. It's also a very secure program, and so despite any kind of misinformation about resettlement being not really a secure program and that its vetting process is not great, it's probably one of the most vetted processes. It takes years, as Pierre mentioned, the average being 10 years of being able to kind of leave a refugee camp. And so it takes it's a very, very long and tenuous process, and so it's very, very secure. So whatever anyone's telling you, that's not true. Resettlement is also local. Our refugee communities are very vital to our local communities. They are a big part of kind of why our communities thrive. And so refugee resettlement also benefits people, you individually as well. Next slide. What about Afghan evacuees? So over 70,000 Afghans were brought to the US under humanitarian parole as part of the US military evacuation following the fall of the Afghan elected government. Humanitarian parole provides temporary 2-year protections for Afghans, after which they must find another means to stay lawfully in the US. And so it's important that Congress passes an adjustment act normalizing the evacuees' legal status and keep America's promise to them. Congress has passed an adjustment act for every other US wartime evacuation to the US. So, for example, the Cubans after the rise of Fidel Castro, Vietnamese and Cambodians after the fall of Saigon, and multiple generations of Vietnamese following the US military engagements there. And so an action to do the same following America's longest war would be a historic failure, especially considering that a lot of the reasons why folks are in the situation that they are is because of our participation in Afghanistan for so long, and kind of the destabilization of that region. So it's up to us to make sure that we are taking care of Afghanistan, of Afghan refugees. Next slide, please. What's happening with Ukrainian refugees? So President Biden recently announced the Uniting for Ukraine program to help welcome 100,000 Ukrainians who have been displaced. The majority of Ukrainians would likely enter through humanitarian parole, so the same legal status of the recently evacuated Afghans. And like evacuated Afghans, without an act of Congress, Ukrainians who are unable to return home for safety reasons after that, temporary parole period finishes will need to pursue a separate protection status, putting their long-term safety on shaky ground. So it's very vital that we urge our members of Congress to support a legislation that is able to make or is able to protect Ukrainian refugees, similarly to kind of the policies that we're hoping to advocate for Afghan refugees. Next slide. So one of our policy asks, what you want for refugees and those seeking asylum. It's first and foremost, one of our main policy asks is rebuilding and strengthening the U.S. refugee admissions program. As we said before, the U.S. refugee resettlement program admissions program has been attacked. It's been in a way it's been, what's the word? It's been weakened greatly by the Trump administration, and we still haven't gone to kind of numbers admissions from pre-Trump years, and so it's important that we urge Biden and the administration to really rebuild that program. Second, it's important that we restore full access and strengthening the U.S. asylum and humanitarian protections, as we've seen with the Haitian asylum seekers at the border in the past year, and kind of the outright deportation of, I think, roughly, I don't know the current numbers now, but from the last time I checked, I think roughly 26,000 Haitian asylum seekers were deported back to Haiti. And it's important to note that asylum is a protected right, by the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's something that asylum is protected under international laws, and so it's important that we really advocate for strengthening our U.S. asylum and humanitarian protections. Third, as Susanna mentioned, protecting stateless people in the United States. And then lastly, supporting the right to legal representation and federal funding to expand legal representation services and backlog reduction efforts in the fiscal year of 2023. Next slide. So after your meeting, it's important to debrief as a team. So it's important, that you discuss with each other, what did we hear and learn? Did we get what we wanted? How do we work together as a team? What are next steps? And then how can we engage as policymaker in the future? Perhaps, if you're an organization, maybe, inviting that member of Congress to events, et cetera. It's important that, following this meeting, that you really strengthen that relationship with that member of Congress, and hope to, for the next year, for your, either your individual aptitude days or when We Are All America does another one similarly, that you build up that rapport and that relationship. And so hopefully, kind of making progress, making strides, and hopefully having them as champions for our refugee communities. And after you debrief with your group lead will send a follow-up email to the staffer, thanking them and also kind of leaving behind, or providing resources and some of the materials from the leave behind folder. But yeah, I think it's very, very important that you debrief, talk about kind of what went well, what didn't go well, what are ways to kind of improve in your next meetings. This is also a very great leadership opportunity for you all as delegates to kind of learn how to engage with elected officials and to share your stories in an effective way and ultimately make change. So it's important that your group lead does provide you space to debrief. Next slide. And I'll pass it back to Nato. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kosar, for that really good, important information on talking points. Okay, so now that you kind of have a better idea on talking points, and I know that this is a lot of information that we are throwing out at you, so our expectation is that you don't feel like you have to know every single thing that we mentioned today, or every single talking point or bullet point. It's just information that we wanted to share with you to help best prepare you and use this to help prepare you for the coming meetings. But don't feel like you need to know every single talking point. Okay, we're gonna quickly go over comms and media, and then we'll open it up for questions. I see a couple questions in the chat box. So as far as comms and media, we can go to the next slide. We do have our social media toolkit that we put together. Our digital organizer Andres, we put a lovely toolkit together for us. We do ask if you are able to get a photo during your meeting, take a selfie before or after your meeting or during your meeting, of course, with the permission of the member of Congress or staffer. We do have a few hashtags if you use social media, just so we can uplift during that week. We would really appreciate that. And next slide. And so we'll share out the social media toolkit here. And we will have a press release that's going to go out on Monday to really uplift the advocacy days and also the Afghan Adjustment Act and a couple of different engagement pieces with the media for the upcoming weeks. So stay tuned for that. We'll send out the press release to you as well on Monday morning. So when you open your email, you'll have that first thing. All right, next slide. And then finally, these are the two trainings we had. We had one last Friday, and this one, it is recorded. We will send out the recording after this, along with the slide deck and the participant handout. For those of you who may be newer to advocacy, we do have a couple of other pre-recorded workshops on different topics, including Government 101, 201, effective storytelling and messaging, power of organizing and leadership, and how to best practices around engaging your local elected officials. So feel free to watch those on your own time if you feel like you want to be a little bit better prepared, or if you're new to advocacy, those are really, really helpful, who are put together by our advocates and organizers. All right, I think that's it. Let us open it up for questions for a few minutes before we wrap up. I think there was a question, and Susanna, I'm not sure if you're still on. I think you are. I think there was a question around the Afghan Adjustment Act. Oh, I don't think she's on. Miranda, I will get that answer for you. I will save, I don't know the exact answer to that, but I will save this question and get clarity around that. Another question, are we expected to take other steps after this lobby visits? So after this advocacy days, we will have a take action for folks who want to continue to advocate, particularly around the Afghan Adjustment Act. There will also be another virtual advocacy day sometime in September, specifically around the Afghan Adjustment Act through Human Rights First. So if you want to continue to be engaged, there is that opportunity. And we will send out after advocacy days follow-ups to all of the congressional offices. And if there are any next steps that need to be taken, particularly with specific congressional offices, we will certainly let you know. Okay, are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. All right, so if there are no other questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Just for next steps, remember that your accompanier will reach out to you. If you haven't heard from them, feel free to email me, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to connect you. Some of the schedules are still being finalized, and remember to review your participant handbook. And I will put my email in the chat box again. If anyone has any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you all so much for your commitment and for your willingness to do this. And we appreciate it very, very much. Thank you. And let's get these advocacy days going. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.